You're listening to episode 59 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ethan Nichtern speaks with us today about the Interdependence project. Taking new forms. Neither Buddhism nor any religious form is immune to the process of evolution. And what forms will these take in our contemporary culture? Much of that is based on communication, conveying messages across different media and using technology to support that growing. Ethan Nichtern is the founding director of the Interdependence Project, a New York City-based non-profit dedicated to Buddhist-inspired meditation and psychology, integral activism, mindful arts, and meaningful media. He is also author of the acclaimed book One City, A Declaration of Interdependence. His writing has been featured on Huffington Post, BeliefNet, Tricycle Magazine, Buddha Dharma Magazine, Reality Sandwich, and other online publications. Ethan has been teaching meditation and Buddhism in the Shambhala tradition since 2002. He is currently on the part-time faculty at Eugene Lang College at New School University and lectures regularly at Brown, Wesleyan, and New York universities. In the summer of 2010, he was empowered by his teacher, Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, as a Shastri of the Shambhala tradition representing the New York region. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice tea from Long Island. And our guest today is Ethan Nichtern. Ethan is the executive director of the Interdependence Project. Ethan, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very glad to be chatting with you. What I'd like to do is start with a discussion of what your background is as a Westerner, how you first encountered Buddhism.
I first encountered Buddhism in my parents' bedroom.
So it was a religious experience, you're saying?
I don't remember encountering, but I actually lived at a Buddhist meditation center when I was a baby. My father was the director, and both my father and mother were early students of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was Tibetan Buddhist pioneer of Buddhism in the West. So they were both students for 5 to 8 years before I was born. That was my first introduction, was having Tibetan Buddhist and Shambhala shrines in my house, and later in our apartment in New York City where I grew up.
So with your own practice when you were a child, did you start meditating right away and going to the Abbey, or did it take a while for you to warm to the practice yourself?
Yeah, I mean, definitely went through phases. I remember taking a class that was just for children at the Shambhala Center in New York when I was about 10 years old, I think 1988. And it was boring. I thought the girl in front of me was cute, and she told me I was breathing too loud when we were done meditating, and that hurt my feelings because I had asthma. and that was pretty much my history with girls for, from up until age 16 or 17.
The cute girls always complain about heavy breathing. Why is that?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But, but I would meditate a little bit. A lot of times my parents, when they were, when I was 10, 11, 12, if they were going to practice for a little while, they'd invite me in, and I'd usually sit for a few minutes. And it was really when I was early teenager, I'd say my freshman year of high school, I started reading Chogyam Trungpa, started reading Thich Nhat Hanh, and really resonated with how much room there was in the philosophy and the psychological teachings for one's own experience. And I really like to argue a lot then. I really hate to argue now, that's an interesting growing up process and arguing. But I remember sitting and reading a book like Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism and or Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and kind of arguing with the page as if I was in like a dialectic debate with the teacher. And it just felt like there was a lot of room for that. And I did my first weekend meditation retreat when I was about 15. And but I didn't really develop my own practice until my senior year of high school, so when I was about 17. And I kind of did that in secret because I didn't want my parents to know. I wanted to be my thing. And then got really into it in college. The whole decade of my 20s, which now I feel nostalgia for, was absorbed with the Dharma. So I don't have any regrets, definitely, but at some point I became a big serious Buddhist, and I'm not sure how that happened.
Yeah, it's a slow progress, but you get there. So you grew up and you had this practice, and then it actually became part of what your daily life was. You became very serious about it. How did this lead into work in social activism and arts and media?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the Interdependence project, my primary interest was always the feeling, without insulting, because I really mean it in a sense, as a compliment to all of the Asian lineages and Asian masters who brought this over. But I had a feeling in college, especially because so many, I worked with depression in college, and so many of my friends worked with depression, that there was so much in the teachings of meditation and Buddhist psychology and Buddha nature and basic goodness, and working with, kleshas or afflictions, that was so relevant, but packaged in such a way that it was so inaccessible, and I think Buddhism's always going to be a hard sell for people in the sense that it's always going to be hard work. But when it also, that's a hard enough sell for me. When on top of that, it feels really inaccessible, really foreign, really not meeting somebody's cultural experience and not meeting the activities that they're interested in, that feels like too big a barrier. I think actually some non-Buddhists are doing more work in some ways to spread the Dharma than Buddhists, especially in the field of Western psychology. They're just stealing our stuff left and right. I'm a big fan and student of Western psychology, especially seems cognitive behavioral therapy is just, and I mean that in the best, the best compliment, if you like somebody's stuff, is to steal it. So,
it's true. When we run into that challenge of being Westerners, we can approach meditation, hear good things about it, and maybe look at it as something we might want to look into. And the places we typically go to that would be a Zen center or some kind of temple where there's a cultural hurdle that we have to overcome.
Yeah.
And there is, even if we overcome the cultural hurdles, there is still then on top of that, and sometimes very inextricably linked with that, a religious
hurdle for those of us we don't particularly resonate with a religious practice. It's not that there's anything wrong with that for many people. That's great for others. It really is. But for many of us, I'm not Asian. So culturally, I don't have a framework of reference for that. I can adapt some of the forms, and that's pretty easy, but it's not something I was born into and raised with. And religious stuff never really resonated for many of us. And so having a more, as you say on the website, the Interdependence Project brings a secular and highly accessible approach to studying and practice. And what you're doing here with the project and what you've been describing is making this available to people without having to adopt a cultural or religious framework that may not resonate with them. It's not about taking down someone else's way of approaching it. It's about making it available to others. Definitely.
And yeah, I think so. It's, it was an interesting path for me because my tradition, and I've studied a fair amount of different traditions, and I study with a Zen teacher, and I study insight and Theravada as much as I can. But my main tradition is the Shambhala tradition, which is, I think it would be safe to say, is considered one of the most Western or Westernized of the Tibetan Buddhist schools. But it's still actually, when I brought friends in college to a talk, it would still be sort of foreign, and I think it's very interesting whenever you introduce somebody to a pre-existing form. I don't think it's necessarily what the form is. It's whenever you introduce somebody to a form, even if it's a Western form, if it's something they're not familiar with, there's two basic approaches to it. There's one is do it, be a little confused by it, maybe be a little bit resistant to it, like bowing, like having a shrine, whatever it is. And by doing it, the meaning of the form reveals itself to you. I think there's actually great wisdom in that approach. I think but that only works for people who stay long enough not to get turned off and to meet their resistance.
Right.
And the other approach is, and I think this really comes out of my study and I think, being, I think technically I'm a late generation X person. But our generation grew up with, a very postmodern, educational framework and worldview where you don't take any form and say that it exists outside of context. So if somebody tells you a spiritual story, I'm sort of almost to a fault. I'm kind of unable to hear a narrative without wanting to know the functioning of the narrative and the power dynamics in the narrative. And same thing with form is it's like, so what is the meaning of the bow, And I don't think we're in a generation, obviously there's some very mystical aspects, that resonate with people too. So that's the other side of this. But I don't think generally speaking, this generation is interested in being handed something and saying, here, do it. We're very, interested in understanding the context and functioning of whatever form or whatever teaching we engage in.
And that's what we see in Buddhist modernism is there is a questioning, and we want to be able to question with conviction, knowing that these are going to be addressed not as it's okay to question as long as you come up with this answer. No, we want to sincerely question. Mm-hmm. And that we're not as accepting in our modern view of things with what a hierarchy or a figurehead may say to us. We want to put it to the test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's true at this. I mean, then there's this whole other strand at the same time, which is very interesting to think about this because we're not accepting of hierarchy yet. America has the biggest celebrity culture that's ever existed, so, I was saying in class the other week, when people say they're averse to a shrine, most American households have a shrine in their living room. It's called the television. Mm-hmm. and we put images on that television of people that we, want to bow to and want to respect and want to to voyeuristically follow it, except, those people are like Snooki from
right.
Jersey Shore. So, the shrine in and of itself is just, putting a place in your home where you feel a sense of sacredness and holiness. And when you're in front of it, you say, this is a practice space. My high school actually in the central meeting hall, this was actually they used this in the movie Scent of a Woman. It's actually, they make it seem like it's a boarding school somewhere in New England, but it's actually, in Manhattan. And it says above the speaker, the place where people come to seek the highest is holy ground. So I think when you approach form like that, the idea that you are investing in it and your practice is sacred because it's meaningful to you, then forms all of a sudden become really meaningful and helpful again. I just don't know how much with this generation of deconstructed learning and contextual learning and cultural subjectivity that we're sort of implanted with, how much just bare forms are going to really resonate with people. I think they're more generally going to be a turnoff.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on exactly the right point, that it's not so much the idea that we reject traditional forms. Certainly that may be part of one's secular practice. It's not saying they're wrong for others. They are right for others. It's that we may have different forms with which we're not comfortable yet, because we don't even know what they are, because it's so early on in the development of Buddhism in the West.
It is very early. There's 2 points on that in terms of the development. If you look at any other, and this is something many people say, if you look at any other culture where Buddhism has spread, it takes several hundred years for it to actually.
Yeah.
But the other part of that that's very interesting is there hasn't been a place, and the pace of history has accelerated greatly and continues to accelerate. And so there hasn't been a place that Buddhism has moved to that where the pace of culture changing in that society that it's moved to happens as rapidly as it happens now in the Western world. So what it really means is you have to be in Buddhist teachers and Buddhist communities, I think, have to be more highly adaptable to changing circumstances and changing culture. Not just a little more, but an increasing amount more, exponentially more.
Well, it seems a great deal of what I see on the website, and I'll mention this probably a couple of times, is www.theidproject.org, and that's THEIDPROJECT.org. A lot of what you have out here is based, from what I'm seeing, on communication. Activism, arts, media, blogs, podcasts and video, things like that. Mm-hmm. I take it the idea of communicating clearly what we're about is a big part of what the ID Project is about.
Communicating, you mean across, in sort of across the internet, or? Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons, one of the both great things and challenges of our community and our organization is we're working on building this kind of hybrid community that's part a great in-person community, which is primarily in New York City right now, although we have a couple of other groups and might start other groups. And at the same time, having a thriving online community through online courses, through the free podcast that we have, which has, great interviews and things and some lectures. Through our blog, I really think our blog is fun and getting cooler, and video projects and things like that. So on the media side of things, yeah, I would say we're going for, and it's challenging, but it's actually working to build a community that's both an in-person community and a vibrant online community where a lot of people from all over the place, participate in our online classes and things like that, and on the blog. So, I think communications, obviously the idea of interdependence, I really think that's the core, since this is a secular Buddhist podcast, I really think if you had to distill Buddhist ethics and Buddhist psychology and Buddhist philosophy down into two core, what you could call secular humanist values, that could be applicable to anybody. It's mindfulness, which is actually the ability to be in the present moment, to come back, to actually harness your mind's ability to place your attention where you would like it to be, and to have that be the kind of core learning tool that a human being has in their life. And the other is, the more ethical view of interdependence. So that nothing happens in a vacuum, and that we live in a completely globalized world, even though we still have, seemingly an American value system that kind of refuses to acknowledge how connected everything is. But those two things I think are really key. And I think interdependence as having a really thriving online community there's obviously a connection there.
Mm-hmm. Folks who go to the website, if you click on the blog, you'll see that there are typically several articles a day coming out, and all of them are really, really a good read. So I make a point of getting out there, because that's what is being done here, is a grassroots how we, the people, are putting this into practice and what we're seeing. So it's a great vehicle for communication and information about what's going on and our particular approach to Buddhist practice.
Yeah.
Ethan, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges that Buddhism and the practice of meditation faces in our modern Western culture?
Yeah. There's two main challenges that I see, and the other thing is that my main teaching path, although, teach a lot at the Interdependence Project, but I'm actually Shastri, which means senior teacher in the Shambhala tradition. And so that's really where I try to work with people on developing, if somebody wants a real Buddhist path, and there's the way I think of it for myself is that, we have connections at ID Project with multiple Buddhist lineages, and we're non-sectarian that way, but that there's an aspect of the Dharma that really the ID Project gets at, which is breadth, being broad, spreading further into different societal and cultural applications, and really creating a broad network of applying Buddhist principles to a wide variety of inquiry. And then there's the other side, which is really, it's not really the function of IDP, but it's the what IDP is meant to introduce people to, which is the depth of having a real path with a real teacher and a sangha, and really going on a journey with the practice. So what I think is the main problem, here's the way I'd say it, the main problem with breadth, with really having Buddhism have broad applications, is that I do agree with you in general that the holding on to the idea that Buddhism is a religion, to me seems to be a non-starter. And the question arises, is Buddhism a religion? And I've had this conversation millions of times.
Many times, yeah, we all have.
The problem is there's two words in that question, Buddhism and religion, that each get defined so differently by different people that you have to nail down what do you mean by Buddhism and what do you mean by religion. So, I think there's many forms of Buddhism that are more religious, depending on if we think of religion from a theological standpoint, if we think of it in terms of having a sacred canopy or something like that. I always go back to the Buddha. I think it's pretty clear when you examine his life and what he said that, and you can make arguments both ways on this, that he was the strongest case is that he was an agnostic. And there's a few points where he basically makes fun of Brahma, the way an atheist would, kind of ridicule the idea of God. And so I think, the Buddha, Siddhartha, was an agnostic. I think that's kind of the fairest way to say it. But, it's interesting because some Buddhists are kind of hold on to that label, and others, I think, assume that Buddhism is going to be viewed as a religion. So therefore they take pieces of the Buddhist path that do offer some benefits, definitely, but are fragments of the Buddhist path. I think of all this research that's come out recently and has been coming out for a while, but specifically with mindfulness-based stress reduction.
MBSR is what I was going to mention. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. which is an amazing system, and I'm so happy it exists, and it is so helpful to clinically depressed populations, et cetera. But I would love to see, some clinical research of people actually like practicing a full Buddhist path for a year, rather than just an 8-week, very simplified, stripped down mindfulness practice, which is only one tiny element of the breadth of these psychological and ethical teachings. And so I'm sort of rather than saying Buddhism is a religion and I'm going to practice it as a religion, rather than saying Buddhism is viewed as a religion, so I'm going to pull out this little piece that can pass the secular censors. I'm really kind of with you saying let's actually, we can change language. We can, not overnight, but when you look at, for example, the success of political movements, they change the way people think about words over a very long period of time. They change people's experience of words. And I use the example of yoga. I think 20 years ago in America, there was a much higher percentage of people who thought of yoga as a religious practice than there is today, right. Just because of the normalization of it. So that's something I'm with you on. Is Buddhism actually a religion? I think the Shambhala tradition is really interesting on this point that, like Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, I think the way he would answer this question is that he wouldn't buy the form of the question, that the form of the question is flawed. And his approach was really, there's a couple really awesome quotes where he basically says, and I'm greatly paraphrasing, but that the entire attempt of an individual human being to separate secular from religious truths in their life, and this has nothing to do with freedom of religion or disrespecting separation of church and state, but for an individual human being to say, I have my religion over here, I have my secular life over there, it's a false dichotomy that's just going to create unhappy, split personality people. That what he said is, I've never made a division between the spiritual and the secular. And that's what I think is it's actually, that the Age of Enlightenment actually created a false dichotomy. So that then creates this conversation that's based on frames that, I don't really buy about, and it definitely comes out when people say, religion, and they don't have a clear definition of what religion is to me, other than the things everybody already assumes are a religion.
Well, and one of the early things that we had talked about on the podcast, one of the early episodes, was definitions and labels. And in particular, we circled a lot around spirituality and how we define that. I as a secular practitioner, is what I can consider myself, and very much an atheist in terms of religious belief in gods and deities. Nonetheless, I'm perfectly fine using the word spiritual because we don't have anything else that really grasps the concept of what this practice is.
Right.
And so we do, and I'm glad you were bringing up the idea that changing words is one of the things that we may need to do because we have this idea of, Buddhism is a religion, and it gets that label, and that may cause some challenges for it in moving forward. It may support it in other arenas where people they leave a particular different faith tradition and they're looking for another one to replace it, and that's perfectly fine. But
I would contend that those arenas in our society are much smaller.
Yes.
What you gain
Yes.
is much smaller than what you lose by not allowing it to have the openness to enter, secular, non-religious society fully. That's a much bigger arena in our world.
Yeah, because it can cross so many boundaries that would otherwise exist through cultural or religious groupings that we don't need to do. And what another conversation that's been going on recently is there's the Stephen Jay Gould non-overlapping magisteria, that religion and science, these deal entirely with different things, and there's a firm line between them. And the NOMA idea is one of the ones we struggle with, because we see that on the one hand we have folks who are doing scientific, double-blinded, controlled studies on the effects of meditation on brain, the thickening of sections of the brain. And that's clearly a very scientific kind of approach. And yet, this also impacts one's personal spiritual practice, and it also crosses into lines of how that affects one's social engagement day by day. So to say that, no, these are separate and there is a firm wall between them, maybe not so much.
Yeah. Well, then I want to balance this out by going, you said, the second major class of obstacles, which actually is to be fair to the tradition and to be fair to the depth of the path. Then we have to, look at the second group of obstacles, because that's what I'm proposing stops breadth, stops these teachings from being broadly applied and accessible in different fields and to different types of people in our society. But then there's what's stopping people from going deeper. And I think this is, where some of my, when you have, the flip side of this is actually honoring the path of working in a sangha, working in a lineage, working with a teacher. And I think that's very important. I personally think if we want to earn our credibility to say that I want to be able to apply these teachings in a lot of different ways, we sort of earn that credibility by going deep into the teachings, by understanding the full body of them, not just by picking out the piece that we like and leaving aside the piece that we don't like. So, I think this is tough. One thing about our society, and, this is, something that, I actually interviewed Ponlop Rinpoche, who you guys interviewed, and I asked him what he thought the biggest, obstacle for Westerners practicing was. And, I know what in working with a lot of people, I know what I think it is, which is just we have a serious sense of inadequacy about ourselves and a lack of confidence that we possess Buddha nature and can actually actualize wisdom and compassion in our life. He framed it differently. He said it's speed. People are just too busy, And so I was thinking about that, because I was going the more kind of heart or psychological route, and he was going the more kind of circumstantial or cultural route. But what does speed do? And I really feel this way, is it makes you do a lot of different things superficially, that you don't go deep into anything. And it also makes you lose your basic core aspirations or intentionality for why you do the things you do in a day. And so I do think that, I think the flip side of this is there are a lot of people, and I don't think it's any problem from the breadth perspective, but I know a lot of people who could really benefit from going deeper in a particular lineage or with a particular teacher and actually struggling through how to make the link between tradition and accessibility in their own life. Because at a certain point, these teachings are about surrendering ourselves, surrendering our sense of what I want, how I want to express is the most important thing.
Yeah, letting go of our grasping. And Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche had the same answer when I asked that question, is what the challenges were, and that we're so busy, we don't have time or we don't make the time, or we don't think we have the time to really dedicate ourselves to practice and study. And having a conversation with another fan of the podcast and someone who's been on it a few times, we're looking at different ways we are approaching the study and practice. And on their side right now, it's very much a scholarship pursuit. it's learning the Pali, going into the suttas and really diving into it in that fashion. And they're trying to have an understanding of what my kind of practice was, and it's not that there's anything wrong with the scholarship. I do that a great deal myself. It's that certain things that are in the teaching may not be areas that I resonate with or find value in. It's not that these are then ignored. It's that the practice itself isn't necessarily dependent on them. So I think you're absolutely right that we still need to do the deep dive and do the practice. And as Ajahn Chah said, if you have time to breathe, you have time to meditate. We need to not just do that surface, but the in-depth. And it's not just the MBSR, which is a wonderful program. There's great benefit to it, but it's more comprehensive than that. And so there is a breadth, but we need to really dive into the practice and do it and plumb those depths, which I think you're right. With our busy days, we're not doing that so much.
Yeah, and it's not just busy days. It's also, I think we have, especially the people, the people who are, for the most part, I would say, generally interested in the Dharma are people who either have an atheistic tendency, or they felt burned by a former spiritual or religious tradition, so there's some kind of fear of commitment that takes people at a certain point, and I think that's it's actually important to face that and work with it. I think the other aspect of that is there's still, relative to the interest in these teachings and practices, there's still very few teachers who are available to really work with people in the Western world. On an eye level basis, and what I mean by that is teachers who you could go to their class every week and meet with them and have a actual relationship. And I think that has to, the Western Dharma teacher, path has to grow and flourish, to meet the interest in it. It can't just be like, hey, I went to this event with the Dalai Lama, or, I go to Tara Brach's, weekly class and there's 500 people there. That's not studying. That's studying with an instructor, definitely, and there's great benefit to that. And obviously Tara Brach's a great teacher. That's why so many people come. But that's, from the student standpoint, that's not actually having a relationship with a teacher. That's very, and it's an interesting dilemma. So I'm just trying to draw out and balance, because my tendency is to be very much like, screw it if it's not accessible, but at the same time, I've learned, so much from having my main teacher, Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche, from having to have a super devoted, relationship to him, that when it's genuine in my screw it if it's not accessible, that every ounce of that comes from a place of having surrendered a little bit more to the practice. Otherwise, it's just me, lashing out.
Yeah, being contrary. Yeah. That's the subject of teachers is one of the other things that comes up frequently for Western Buddhists is, as we may not come from a particular tradition, the way we validate and authenticate, is this someone who is a good teacher? Is this someone I would actually want to have that relationship with? Is kind of tough, because that has been traditionally, you come from a lineage and you have transmission papers or something like that.
Right.
I see on Interdependence Project, you have Buddhist studies programs, but you also have teacher training programs. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, so we're doing our first teacher training program right now, and it was a very interesting process for me to decide to do that. But the facilitator training program, it really has a couple different aspects, which is, one, people who are really serious and want to take the time. It's a year-long, real chance to deepen practice and study. And I'm really a fan of. I've only been teaching for about 9 years at this point, but I've been doing it at times mostly full time, sometimes, and since I became this Shastri role, more than full time. And that's, I think, a little bit rare in the Buddhist world. So I've really become a fan through teaching a lot of, thanapedagogy and what works and what doesn't work. And there's so many in Western educational studies. There's so many great teachings on how to teach that I think the Buddhist lineages can absorb. That's the other thing. It's not just about Buddhism coming to the West. It's also about Western wisdom coming into Buddhism as well. And so a few of the people who are doing that program are already certified as teachers in different lineages, but really wanted to create a program because there isn't one for people who want to just be certified as a more secular meditation teacher and say, I've really gone through this year-long training program and I have a practice and I've studied, and also wanted a program for certification for people who might want to apply some basic mindfulness skills in their therapy work, for example. There's a lot of people in this world who are, and just to say that clearly, not everybody's guaranteed to be authorized as a teacher through IDP doing the training. It's really viewed as, this is a year-long deepening experience for you, but some people will. And I think we have a lot of therapists, a lot of teachers, a lot of people who work in healing in our community as well. And I think the idea of, a therapist being able to say, I'm actually on top of my, on top of my psychotherapy training, I'm also trained as a meditation instructor. I don't know at this point. I mean, there's, Spirit Rock training. I know Tar Box training. Most of the trainings I know that are the most secular actually happen to be in the Insight, lineage.
Yeah, all of them. I know. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I thought that's pretty important, and because a lot of what happens is a little bit of a Wild West approach that people don't have, any formal training in teaching, and they're doing it because, they didn't connect with the lineage, or they said, I don't want to go all the way through that intensive Zen training program or that intensive Vajrayana training program. I have a practice. I am a student. I'm not particularly a student of one lineage, and I want some tools to be able to apply to helping other people along some basic path. So I think I've only had one weekend of the training. It's a great group of people, and we're really studying together what works and what doesn't work from a pedagogical, from a teaching standpoint. What resonates with students? What methodologies can we bring in that are maybe new methodologies of how to transmit the Dharma to different audiences and in different contexts. So that's definitely, having a secular Buddhist meditation training, I think is really, is a great thing. And that's, I envision that as pretty much the deepest offering in this breadth versus depth thing that ID Project does. But I think it's important. I really was talking to one of my teachers, Enkyo Roshi, who's involved with the Interdependence Project and is the head of the Village Zendo here in New York. And just, she was saying that she wants 100 years from now for little children in kindergarten to learn how to place their attention. That's really, we're not, from my point of view, we need to not mistake the means from the ends. Like, the means might be the establishment and deepening of more Buddhist sanghas, and, the path that I come from, the Vajrayana path. It's very in depth. It's very beautiful. It has lots of beautiful teachings that we don't want to lose. But the point of that path is not to practice the Vajrayana.
Right.
It's a path of skillful means to get human beings to the place where they're more able to meet their human society with wisdom and compassion, from my point of view. So I think the more applications we can develop that both bring about depth and breadth are really, really helpful.
Totally agree with you. The idea that we have a growing body of Western teachers who have this kind of approach that has the breadth and depth that you're talking about, I think that's just going to continue growing.
Yeah. And the other thing that's very interesting about it is I was asking this because I was co-teaching a class with my friend Dr. Jonathan Kaplan, who's a a meditation student and practitioner, but he's also a PhD in cognitive behavioral therapist. So I said, is there anything, like when you get a PhD or in any form of licensing, I didn't think there was, but is there anything akin to the Bodhisattva vow? The idea of actually that the reason you would work with other people's minds is to, in medicine there's the Hippocratic Oath, but that you would, that your intention is to be of benefit, and you keep coming back to that intention. He said, nope, there's nothing like that.
and I think shocking when you think about it.
It is, well, it is and it isn't. I mean, that's the American, if we start introducing the Bodhisattva intention into American culture, it would be, shocking in a lot of ways. Every organization, every corporation would have to become a non-profit corporation. So yeah, I think that's really, I think there's something about the genuineness of the Buddhist path in all of these lineages that can come through and teach people how to be, both teachers and leaders in a lot of, applied ways. At the same time, it's always sad to me, and I get it, but I never get it, whenever there's a new scandal involving a Buddhist teacher, it's really, I get it, but I don't get it, I do think we need to, Buddhists, as we get into the territory of, applying our principles to Western life, we do need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, which is not some kind of, for me, it's not some kind of moral purity or I never drink or I'm a monk. The higher standard is openness and honesty. That's, whenever one of these scandals comes out, what bothers people is not that the person was having sex or whatever. What bothers people is that the person was pretending, the person who's supposed to be a model for openness and self-awareness was pretending one thing and doing another. That's what bothers people. It's not, oh, you had sex with a student. It's like, everybody knows that if the power dynamic is understood, things happen, and if there's a mutuality and there's and nobody's asking people, unless you're a monastic, to be, to never have an intoxicant in your body. I'd have to give up coffee right now if that was true. It's just to be honest about who you are and have some sense of balance and integrity and decency. And I do see, that's growing more. It seemed there was a little bit more wildness to me in the ways it seems and what I hear that Buddhist Sangha has manifested earlier on. The people who come to IDP, they're fun-loving for sure, and they tend to be younger. I think the bulk of our core community is 30-somethings. So that's younger than many Buddhist Sanghas in America. But they're fun-loving, but also it's like there's a real sense of identity politics, and a sensitivity towards gender and racial dynamics and class dynamics and things like that. So I think that kind of sensitivity, which is, I think the result of many, many factors, solves a lot of the problems that might lead to what we call, perverting the teachings or something like that. I do think, from my point of view, every human being who works in service and works with the minds of others should take some form of a vow of bodhisattva, obviously not using that language because that would be lame to use Sanskrit, but some form of the vow of saying, I'm doing this to actually be of benefit. That's my core value. That's
setting the intention.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The website for people who've been listening to the podcast, again, this is the Interdependence Project. The address is www.theidproject.org. We've been speaking with Ethan Nichtern, who's the executive director. Ethan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm I'm glad there's I have to go on record and say I'm a secular sacred Buddhist, but that's what Trungpa Rinpoche would want me to say. But I like the secular side more, and I struggle with the sacred side. So I definitely love the intention of your website and podcast. I think it's great.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on the Secular Buddhist.